Okay, so let's start. A very, very, very warm welcome indeed, literally, to all of us. Thank you for coming, despite the heat outside and inside. So I'm very happy to host tonight's talk of Maria Bussmann and Jennifer Higgie, which is also a book presentation by Jennifer Higgie. So I'm very happy also that we actually have like one copy of the book to look at here, thanks to Tina Teufel. Thank you so much for bringing one. I will quickly introduce you two, and then Maria and Jennifer will facilitate the talk by themselves, and afterwards there's also a possibility for some questions from your side. So Maria Bussmann is both an artist and philosopher, and her works represent an insistent attempt to fathom the epistemological quality of her medium of drawing. Her subjects grow out of her trust in the generative force of philosophy and literature, as well as out of personal references such as temporary places of residence or current political discussions. Since 2000, she has been a lecturer at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, at the Institute of Art Theory, and a lecturer in gender studies. And this year, she's also teaching a course at Summer Academy called Sharpening Pencils and Thought, which also emphasizes the relation between philosophy and art. And Jennifer Higgie was trained a painter as well, but had a 25-year career as a writer, first as a reviews editor, as well as an editor-in-chief of Frieze magazine, and more recently, the editor of the Annual, published by the National Gallery of Australia. Also trained as a, she has written for numerous magazines, newspapers, and artist catalogs, and is also this year teaching at Summer Academy a class on writing. And among her most recent books are The Mirror and the Palette, Revolution, Rebellion, and Resilience, 500 Years of Women's Self-Portraits from 2021, and her latest one from 2023, which is also today's talk's title, is The Other Side, A Journey into Women, Art, and Her Spirit World. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for coming tonight, and I'll give the mic to you.
You go ahead.
Okay, is that working? Great, everyone can hear me. Thank you so much, Maximilian, and thank you very much to the Summer Academy for hosting Maria and I, and I'm very honored that Maria is talking to me tonight.
Same for me, you know.
You. And wonderful to see my brilliant class here, our brilliant class here. Thank you so much for taking a position. Lovely to see you all. So before we start talking, I'm going to read an excerpt from my book, just the opening, so that you get an idea of it, because it's actually the most personal book that I've ever written. And so it'll just sort of set the scene. And to start it off, we're going to look at this statue of Nausicaa, which I actually took this photograph when I was swimming. So I'm quite proud of it. Okay, so I'll just start. Oh, sorry, just one sec, I've just got to find it. And it's an actual book. Amazing, not a printout. Sorry, I have to put on my glasses. Okay, this is the prologue to The Other Side, A Journey into Women, Art, and the Spirit World. And I open actually with a quote. This is really boomy, isn't it? Is it all right? I open with a quote from Madeline Miller, who is a brilliant ancient historian, from her novel Circe, which is a feminist retelling of the Greek myth Circe. And she says, "I thought, I cannot bear this world a moment longer. Then, child, make another." In 1996, I went to a Greek island to write a novel about a 19th century fairy painter. 25 years later, I returned to write about women artists, and the spirit world. In Greece, the idea of magical women is nothing new. For more than 12 centuries, the high priestess at the Temple of Apollo, also known as the Oracle of Delphi, counseled mortals, and even today, each mention of Athens invokes the goddess of wisdom and war. Recitations of ancient Greek poetry always begin with an entreaty to the 9 female muses, the source of all inspiration. Their mother, Mnemosyne, is the goddess of memory. Both periods in my life were times of great transition. In 1996, I was a painter working as a waitress who was becoming a writer. Little did I suspect that on my return to London, I would become an editor at a contemporary art magazine, something I had never imagined or planned. 2 decades later, I left my job at Frieze to write full-time. Everything felt hopeful and precarious. To make such a leap involves levels of self-confidence I wasn't entirely sure I possessed. But something needed to change. The relentlessness of it all had worn me out. The juggling involved in trying to write alongside a full-time job, the endless daily decisions, the keeping abreast of every twist and turn of the contemporary art world, and the constant demand to have an opinion. In the late summer of 2021, I, like everyone else, was rocked by the interminable pandemic, but the enforced solitude made something very clear. I wanted to return to a place of speculation, to open myself up to new ways of inhabiting the world. I wanted to embrace doubt, nurture curiosity, write with no conclusion. The precariousness of it all, financial, emotional, intellectual, scared me. What I longed for was a kind of re-enchantment, something that art is very good at. I think I'll stop there, actually. Yeah. You can buy it at any good bookshop to see what else happens.
Jennifer. Hello? Yes, now it's working. Oh, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Jennifer sent me the text before, so I hear it the third time actually. I read it before. And already the title of the book, The Other Side, it was fascinating for me, so it was no question that I would do this conversation with her. And I think this introduction is so beautiful because it's a personal introduction, and this is rare actually in such books. And for this I want to thank you first, and to pick this subject at all, just beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, should we start to show some of the images,
sure.
maybe?
Yeah.
I mean, I loved actually the chapters because the titles are especially cool. And the titles are, well, you could read some of them too. Or
the chapters are...
They're really, really beautiful. And each is dedicated to another wonderful woman in art history and in history of mankind. You will see. Okay.
The chapters are called A Season in the Life of a Thought, Enter the Fairies, Islands in the Mist, Mysterious Knockers, The Cracked People, A Dagger in Her Hair, Oceanic States, The Benefits of Not Knowing. Actually, for that one, The Benefits of Not Knowing, we'll go to this amazing image. The Benefits of Not Knowing, Between Mortals and Beings, Thought Forms, Magnetic Fields, She Danced a Goldfish, New Worlds, The Vibrations of Different Souls, Demeter in Paris, In the Cards, Witch Dance, Trees of Knowledge, The Active Imagination, Weaving Their Way, Temenos, and Into the Ether. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, you start very early, like with this. It's like the Venus of Willendorf, which the Austrians know very well. This prehistoric stuff, and then, well, like in the Middle Ages, Hildegard from Bingen, and then it goes up in our times. So this is also something which I always like to focus on, this huge span of time. You know, it's not just our art history, it's not just the last, let's say 200, 500, even 2,000 years, it's way, way longer. And that makes a complete different perspective on so many things in life, actually. So maybe, I don't know, I have so many questions prepared, actually. I don't know which one would be the best. Okay. Maybe going back to your childhood, actually. Because to be fascinated by spirits, ghosts, and this stuff usually dates back to quite a long time. And to be honest, I was totally scared of ghosts in my childhood. And I don't tell too much now, but I was very close to meet a ghost too at a certain point. Being the daughter of a homeopath, and my grandfather was in homeopathy, well, other stories appeared. So my question was, when did it start that you had an interest? Because you said that was 20 years ago, it was a time of change, and now, but probably earlier.
I mean, I think I've always been really interested in the idea of things that we can't see and what they might mean. And I think especially when you're interested in art, and I've always been interested in art ever since I was a child, you know, the idea of spirits or demons or angels is nothing new in art. This idea of believing in powers from a different dimension, I mean, that's what Renaissance art is full of, for example. It's full of the idea of alchemy, the idea not only that art is the transformation of one idea into something else, but the idea that there are these celestial beings who can descend to the earth and help us make sense of what we see. So if you have a great love for Renaissance art, you're immediately in there. But of course it goes way back too, and I've always been interested in the idea of not knowing as much as knowing. And one of the reasons I included this extraordinary sculpture, which is only about that, you know, it's only 10 centimeters big, is that it's the oldest surviving sculpture on Earth that we know of that might represent a human being. But at the same time, we know nothing about prehistoric culture. We don't know what this little object was. For example, it's got a little loop, so it might have been worn around someone's neck. It might have had different materials in it. Who knows what it represents? But we can explore myriad ideas through things we don't know. And I've always believed in spirits and ghosts and intuition and premonition and dreams, because I think we all experience those. Well, not everyone experiences ghosts, but everyone that I know of has experienced, everyone has dreamt, everyone has had different access to different worlds through their dreams. Everyone has had a sense of premonition or an instinct about something or felt a coincidence.
I would even extend it as you did anyway. We all are limited, we will die at a certain point, and we all lost somebody in life. So to communicate with the dead is also a special thing about the nature of a ghost, or what a ghost could be. This connection to the deaf in general, how to deal with that, no?
Yeah.
How to connect. Well, religions offer a lot in this. I mean, if you see it in a broader sense, not just the Catholic, Protestant, or whatever, but in general, it's so much about why are we on Earth, and so it puts all the big philosophical questions, actually.
Absolutely, and I think in that sense it's not necessarily an illogical endeavor, it's also a scientific one. And that's what's so interesting in the 19th century, when you see a concurrent surge in really radical scientific experiments. You know, the idea of the atom, the idea of the X-ray, the idea of a telegram sending a message across seas. And so ideas began that if you could start seeing inside someone or communicating with someone on the other side of the world, well, maybe what we understand of time, which physicists has always said, we know nothing about time, well, possibly there are ways of accessing different times. And, you know, as I said, I've always been interested in what is not talked about as well. And, you know, in terms of my book, the focus, I should say, you know, is around women or women identifying people. But also the idea of, you know, what has been excluded from the story we've been told about art history. It's not just women, it's people of different class, people of different genders, it's trans people, queer people, working class people, people of color, you know. So all of these stories are around exclusion in a way. And it's so rich because all of these ideas that the classical idea of modernity, which was about rationalism, it was about stripping religion away, it was about being suspicious of intuition, it was about formalism. All of these things negated the, in many ways, preternatural and supernatural beginnings of modernism, which was, much of it was to do with women contacting other spirits that led directly to surrealism.
Absolutely right.
Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer. Yeah.
I think maybe we can get to some examples, because I mean, some I was familiar with, others I've never heard of, and she found great examples.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure probably, considering we're in a German-speaking country, you've all heard of Hildegard of Bingen. Yeah. And when I first went to art school, actually in Canberra, my mother gave me a CD of Hildegard because she said it would be
the
calming.
compositions, no?
Yeah.
It's great.
And, you know, it was the most sublime music, and it was in Latin. I didn't fully understand what it meant, but, you know, the more and more I found about Hildegard of Bingen, you know, she was a naturopath, she was a healer, she was an advisor to governments, she, you know, was the head of a convent. She was an extraordinary composer but never studied music. And she always said, she was very clear, that these ideas came to her. You can see here that they're literally descending to her from the heavens, these ideas. And so she totally believed that, you know, we could exist in many different realms. And she was also a painter. So she was really extraordinary, and she's really influencing a lot of artists now. I keep hearing more and more artists who are really interested in Hildegard of Bingen, in her ideas of greening the planet, in her ideas of healing the planet, in her ideas of, you know, female power, because she, for years, wasn't able to talk about her powers because she was really worried about being excommunicated by the Pope. And so, you know, it's also about the kind of powers that you're not allowed to talk about. So she's a great inspiration, I think, Hildegard of Bingen.
Well, if I can add something, because actually one time I went to Bingen to see that in the manuscripts, and well, she was over 40 when she had this kind of vision, the first visions. And well, she's, in German you would say a Mystikerin, like it's not a mystic in English, it's mysticism, I think, this word. No? And for me it's so special because Mühe in the original word means actually to close the eyes and to wait for this kind of inspiration. Well, the school of seeing also includes that you close the eyes actually once in a while, don't keep them always open, you have to move them. No? And so you get an inspiration which comes directly from God, from the Spirit. And that's why the church has problems with it. But at the same time, it was so fascinating that a woman like her, who was the abbess, the leader of a monastery, would speak like this, like speak in tongues, or, you know, she could not write herself actually. She needed a person to write that stuff down for her in the book of Scivias. And it's fascinating that these mystics don't need the hierarchy, so they go outside of the hierarchy. They get the direct message, no? So, and that makes it so cool. And there's no wonder why so many women in these times actually had this quality. No? I mean, to qualify as a mystic is not so easy, but many reached that. And they had the direct connection by closing their eyes.
I mean, especially in the 19th century when there was this huge surge in spiritualism, and women's groups especially, who got together to explore the other side, but also to make art. And you've got to remember at this time they're excluded from so much. They're not allowed to go to the academy. They have no political agency. They have to get permission from their fathers, their brothers, or their sons to do whatever they want to do. They have no financial security without men. And so they formed these women's groups in a way to create new languages for themselves. And for me, the least interesting idea was, were they telling the truth? Because what they created was so extraordinary. I don't really care how they made it. They had a supportive community, and they made wonderful things outside of the mainstream. And it gave them a great freedom. Should we move on to the next one? What's here?
That's not a woman.
Now, the reason I include Kandinsky, and he's a great artist, and I have nothing against Kandinsky whatsoever, but the traditional story of art and modernism was that Vasily Kandinsky essentially invented abstraction in the West in 1911 with this painting Composition 5. Now, he's a great artist, this is a great painting, but the idea that he invented abstraction is ludicrous. There were many women in the 19th century who were exploring various forms of so-called abstraction, although it becomes a complicated word because abstraction actually represents certain states of mind. It's about an inner reality, not necessarily an external one. And of course, in First Nations cultures, forms of abstraction have been explored for tens of thousands of years. I'm Australian. I mean, there are 40,000-year-old, paintings and caves. So I include him just to show that the original art history that was traditionally told for too long. For example, if you look at Gombrich, who wrote the famous story of art that I studied when I was at art school, and in the first edition in 1962, not one woman was mentioned, not one. And finally, in the 1980s, they started including a few women. But women were entirely written out of the story. And so however great this painting is, it's certainly not the first example of abstraction. Do you want me to talk about this exhibition?
Of course.
Strange Things Among Us. This show opened just during it was open briefly during the first year of lockdown, and it was the London College of Psychic Studies, and it really blew me away. It was curated by this wonderful curator, Vivian Roberts, who's a real specialist in spiritualist art. And it's a great title, Strange Things Among Us. And throughout the exhibition, she was looking at examples of 19th century abstraction, forms of spirit groups who made their art. And there were also wonderful objects in there, and photographs and crystal balls and planchettes. And so I found it was really significant for me, this exhibition, and one of the great inspirations for my book.
Yeah, what's about these sisters?
Well, Maria. So the history of modern spiritualism began with these sisters, Maggie and Kate Fox. And when they were quite young, when they were sort of young teenagers, they said that they heard a rapping of a dead murderer the rapping of a dead man in the basement of their house. And many years later, they admitted it was false. They were dropping apples onto the floor. But basically, they were believed. Their older sister managed their careers, and they became superstars. I mean, they sold out all through America, all through Britain. They went to Australia, they went through Europe, and they would give these spiritualist performances. I could talk about them for hours, so I won't go on and on about them. But basically, they were superstars. And what was really interesting about them, and they had a sad life. They ended up, their childhoods were taken from them. They both died young and alcoholic. But what was powerful about them was that they started this, or rather they brought together this really powerful movement around spiritualism. And these were two young women with no political agency in a culture that doesn't encourage women to have a voice. And they were holding crowds of 4,000 and 5,000 people. So they were enormously influential. They were also, their politics were quite good too. They supported abolitionism, they supported female suffrage, but it was a long and complicated story, what happened to them. And around the same time, a little bit later, this is Madame Blavatsky, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, and she was a Russian emigre, the first Russian woman to get an American passport. And she was born in Ukraine. Then she had a wild life. I mean, you know, she said she went to Tibet and learned from 9 mystical masters. She probably was a jockey and ran away with an opera singer. And, you know, she when she was old, she said, well, not old, she was in her 50s. She said she was a virgin, but she'd had a child and she'd been married a few times. I mean, she basically was a huge liar, but she used lies to tell the truth, what she saw as the truth. So it was a sort of great paradox. She was a great paradoxical performer, fascinating woman. And she was a co-founder of the Theosophical Society, which was to have no religion higher than truth, was its maxim, and it was to have a huge impact on the development of modernity and modern art.
I have to add something personal, sorry guys. It's very funny. I told you I have some stories in my family. The brother of my grandfather, who was born in 1890, he was in the Theosophical Society, and yes, and he lived in Berlin, and he was a lawyer, and he was gay, and in these days that didn't exist. So he wrote a book actually about the penalties that there should not be punishment for younger people. That was his idea. He ended up in prison himself, and this person didn't exist in my family memory, you know. But so I learned this only 10 years ago, that he was a theosoph traveling around making speeches in Switzerland and being a fervent, and so I learned about her too 10 years ago. I mean, amazing, no? Isn't
there
it?
were so many people who were members of the Theosophy. I mean, tens of thousands of people joined up. And, you know, one of the very interesting things about the Theosophical Society, there were some dodgy things about it, and there were some really amazing things about it. And one of them was that it was one of the first sort of groups in the West to really focus on Eastern religions, obviously such as Buddhism or Hinduism, and to treat them as serious religions that were on a par with Christianity and examine what their possibilities were. And also, you know, they called themselves scientists of truth. And what they were about was, this is why they had a big impact on modernity, because they were really interested in trying to explore unseen forces. You know, so you look at all of the early sort of male artists who were really exploring modernity, Kandinsky, Mondrian, Paul Klee, they were all theosophists at various points in their life. Mondrian was for his entire life. And that's why in London at the moment, at Tate Modern, there's a major exhibition on Mondrian and Hilma af Klint. Because Hilma af Klint, who we'll get to, she was obviously a theosophist and then an anthroposophist, which was led by Rudolf Steiner. So really fascinating, controversial figure. And then I just cite some other really amazing women who were very important in terms of spiritualism. Sojourner Truth, extraordinary woman who was born enslaved and then escaped with her daughter and became an extraordinary orator and activist for abolition and for women's rights as well. Her famous speech was "Ain't I a Woman?" where she stood up and berated the men in the audience about what a woman could do. Yeah, amazing. I mentioned 19th century women who were really exploring abstraction, and
one of my favorites, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, wonderful. Yes.
You've got to look at, she looks like a very respectable Victorian woman in the 1860s, but she's got a dagger in her hair. Yeah, see, dagger. So when you look at this, you're like, oh la la, what's that about? And anyway, she went to art school, and then she lived with her mother. She was very close to her sister, who was an artist as well. And we don't know much about her early pre-spiritual work, but then she suffered a lot of tragedies in her life with people dying. And when she was in her 40s, she went to a next-door neighbor who was doing a seance, and she discovered things in the seance that she said no one could possibly know. So she became almost overnight a spiritualist, and she had an extraordinary life. And these were the kind of paintings she was making in 1864. You know, and there were so many of these. And she had an exhibition of her work in New Bond Street. Her spirit guides told her to have an exhibition. So she opened an exhibition in New Bond Street. She sat in the gallery for 3 months, and people would just come and talk to her about her work. And she was really widely reviewed as well. I mean, it would have been like a spaceship descending on Piccadilly. You know, these paintings in 1864. And interestingly, I mean, some of the reviewers, you know, said she was mad, but then other reviewers were really fascinated. And also a lot of artists were coming to her show and talking to her about this idea of expressing and exploring an inner world.
It's even more astonishing that such drawings and such art pieces did not make it in the art history books. This makes me so angry, actually.
Yeah. No, I mean, you know, it's the same old story. It's called the patriarchy. And the second generation of Theosophists were led by Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater. And in 1905, they commissioned a book about picturing inner worlds that became extremely popular among artists and other people as well. But most of the artists were looking at this book, Thought Forms. And these are some of the examples in Thought Forms about clairvoyant investigations into sound, into energy. The one here in the church, that's, I think it's a piece of music by Massenet emanating from a church. I think it was Massenet. Yeah, and so you've got, you know, in 1905, let's just remember that we were taught that Kandinsky invented abstraction in 1911. So this is happening in 1905, this idea of representing inner worlds.
I think we simply have to go on because each chapter is beautiful. Each person is worth knowing and talking about it. So yeah. I just push you. That's all.
I'll whip through. Okay. Hilma af Klint, I'm sure you all know, she's such a superstar now, but she's, you know, absolutely extraordinary. She went to art school in Stockholm. This is her at art school, and her sister died. She didn't become interested in spiritualism just because her sister died, but she was already very interested in not only spiritualism, but as I mentioned before, in science. And it's important to say that many of the scientists were really interested in Theosophy, for example. Like Einstein was interested in it. Thomas Edison was interested in it. Marie Curie was interested in it. Thomas Edison actually tried to design a telephone to contact the dead. Yeah, why not? And so Hilma af Klint, when she graduates from art school, she makes a living making quite conventional, but I rather love them actually, landscapes and portraits. But with her group of women, the five, she starts in 1906 until 1915, exploring under the guidance of certain spirit guides. She makes these paintings. This is her at the Guggenheim. And I should have put on the caption here. These works are from 1906, 1907. And they're called the 10 largest. And she's depicting in these paintings the 10 stages of life from childhood to old age and death. And 1906, 1907, she's doing these.
Compare this to Kandinsky's little picture.
I love Kandinsky. I'm not going to diss Kandinsky, but, you know, look at this. And what was really wonderful about her having this exhibition at the Guggenheim in 2018 was that she had designed a temple to exhibit her works, which never got made. But this woman, Baroness Hilla Riebe, this is her in her studio in Munich in 1911, Hilla Riebe was really interested in Theosophy. And she is exploring abstraction. She's friends with Kandinsky and a lot of the other artists exploring abstraction in Germany at the time. And she goes to New York, and she becomes the chief art advisor to Solomon R. Guggenheim. And anyway, she convinces him to start buying up big abstract works. That's why the Guggenheim has, I don't know how many Kandinskys, a zillion maybe. Anyway, so she says, you need a museum for your work, and I want it to be built along theosophical grounds. Oh, I thought I had a picture of it. Sorry, I must have cut it out. Anyway, you all know what the, oh, whoops. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So anyway, the Guggenheim was built, obviously, along theosophical grounds when she got Frank Lloyd Wright to design it. And so it is like a temple, and it's uncannily like the temple that Hilma af Klint wanted to show her work in. So it was really beautiful that even though Hilla Riebe and Hilma af Klint never met, there's this wonderful sort of synchronicity in that Hilma af Klint's big show was at this, in a sense, theosophically designed. I mean, not that Frank Lloyd Wright was a theosophist, but Hilla Riebe directed him towards spiritual lines in the design of the Guggenheim. So, yeah. And then we've got so many other people who are interested in this world. Sophie Teuber-Arp, the great Swiss artist, from Cabaret Voltaire. He's her dancing at, you know, obviously part of the Dada group. And Suzanne Duchamp. We all know Marcel Duchamp, but his sister Suzanne was an absolutely fascinating artist as well. And as many of these artists were, as many of the entire culture really, was traumatized by the horrors of the First World War and 20 million dead. And so many of them are looking for new ways of understanding the world. And many of them are grieving because they've lost family members and they're looking for ways to contact the dead. And Suzanne and Marcel Duchamp's brother, Raymond, who was a great sculptor, he was injured in the trenches and then he ended up dying of pneumonia in the First World War. And so she was also looking for different ways of using abstraction to explore different states. And Duchamp himself, he translated into French Kandinsky's On the Spiritual in Art, and he described the artist as a clairvoyant. You know, that the function of an artist was one of clairvoyance, to contact other sides, to interpret different realms, to explore different realms. Yeah.
You are a fountain of knowledge. It's unbelievable. It's so beautiful to listen. She could go on and on. Well, we show some more.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Mary Wigman. Okay. Yeah. Now, Mary Wigman, really amazing artist. She was at Monte Verità above Ascona, where there was the artist colony and healing colony that was set up in 1900 that went for about 25 years. And Rudolf Laban, the great dancer and choreographer, was up there. And so Mary Wigman went up to Monte Verità, to this artist community that was very influenced by alternative ideas around veganism, different energies, looking to different cultures to explore our position on the earth. She would dance without music because she wanted to insist that dancing wasn't necessarily just about entertainment. It was something primal and important in terms of self-expression. And my friend Donna actually designed, this is one of her drawings on the cover of my book. And Donna was the one who introduced me to Hilma af Klint many years ago. She had seen a small show of her work, like, I don't know, 20 years ago in Ireland. And Donna did a big performance around, inspired by witch dance. And this is just a still from it. And I actually composed a piece for the Triangle for this for this performance. So I was part of this. It was great. 10 years ago, it was an amazing performance. So it's really important to me to stress the idea that, you know, looking at the art of the past isn't necessarily a nostalgic activity. The past, they have been there before us, and they can teach us so much about our present and our future. And that's always been very important. And so many of these artists are influencing contemporary artists. Then we go on to one of my absolute favorites, Ethel Colquhoun. She was a young spiritualist and occultist and member of the British Surrealists. And she went to Paris, and Man Ray said he would like to take a portrait of her, and she could bring any props she wants. And so she wanted here to present herself as Demeter, the Greek goddess of the harvest. And so somehow in Paris she found a sheaf of wheat, which I'd love to know how she did that. And so she walked across Paris in her nice 1930s fashionable dress with her fashionable makeup, but, you know, connecting herself to the deep past by posing as a goddess. So I absolutely love this portrait. And she was extraordinary. She ended up moving to Cornwall and exploring, like she made an abstract tarot pack. The Tate now has over 5,000 works by her, and I went and looked through the archive, and it was unbelievable. She lived alone in a tiny house without any electricity in nature. She was actually kicked out of the British Surrealists because she wouldn't give up her membership of occult societies. So it was quite funny when the Surrealists get really bossy about, you know, what you can do. And this is one of my favorite paintings of hers. And this is a small painting in Tate Britain called Scylla. And again, it's about the ancient goddess Scylla, who was transformed into a monster by the witch Circe. And Scylla was turned into these furious rocks that you can read about in Homer when they're destroying and devouring sailors.
Odysseus meets them, I think. No? He
Pardon?
makes his Odysseus.
Yes,
he has to go through them.
He has to go through them, yeah.
Yes, and they try to kill every sailor.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And there was another goddess opposite, Charybdis. And so you had to pass, I think it's the Straits of Messina. And so these rocks could kill you. But then Ethel Colquhoun has done this wonderfully sort of witty thing where she's made a reference to the landscape as a vicious goddess. But she's also, it's a form of a self-portrait of herself lying in the bath. You can see her pubic hair, there's a ship coming in, it's very phallic. I think she was having an affair with a fisherman at this point, Ethel was. And you've got the rocks, which are both like knees meeting, but they're also like phalluses. So, you know, it's a classic surrealist technique of having one image, multiple meanings. And I always go and say hello to this painting when I go to Tate, yeah. Yeah. Janet Sabel. Shall I? Okay. So, Janet, again, the history of modernism is not always the one that we were taught. And it's important to remember that art history is a work in progress, I think. And Janet Sabel, she was a Ukrainian refugee in the 1930s to New York, where she lived with her family. And she was a housewife. She was supporting her family. She had 5 children. And then one of her children went to art school. And when he came home with all these art materials, Janet Sabel went, oh my God, and she just went crazy. She was like blowing paint around with a vacuum cleaner and, you know, doing all these amazing experiments just on her own. And anyway, her son was really amazing, and he got in touch with museum directors, and Chagall was living in New York at the time, so they could speak the language together. And anyway, so finally, actually, she got some renown, and Peggy Guggenheim supported her and showed her work. And anyway, if you think of Jackson Pollock, well, he saw this painting. Which was before he did his drip paintings. And I'm not saying that Jackson Pollock wasn't a great innovator, he was, and all artists are influenced by other artists. But Clement Greenberg, in one of his essays, is quite frank. He says, Jackson Pollock and I went to an exhibition at Peggy Guggenheim's, and we saw this strange, you know, drip all over painting. And, you know, we realized it was by, he's very patronizing. He says she's a housewife from Brooklyn. And we furtively were rather interested in it, you know. And this is before Jackson Pollock does his drip paintings, and Janet Sabel is making her drip paintings. And she's really inspired by different kinds of energy, by music, by intuition, by imagination, by dreams. She's very clear that she's not coming from an art historical lineage. She wasn't trained. She's painting purely from instinct and her sort of own joy in materials. And a really brilliant curator at Museum of Modern Art in New York bought this painting. So it's actually in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And it's a small painting, but it's a very significant one. I sort of leap around in time and place, so I'm sorry, this all seems a bit schizophrenic when I do it at this pace.
No, it's so beautiful. So that's also one of my next favorites. But go ahead.
Is it? What do you like about her?
Well, I think this dress, like a nurse a bit, and this kind of drawing, how she deals with that forms, is you see it better big. But go on. I love to listen to you.
Oh, thank you, Maria. But, so Emma Kunz, she was a Swiss healer who lived in the countryside in Switzerland, and she found an extract from this from a mineral source called A, which you can still buy in Swiss pharmacies. And Hans Ulrich Obrist always rubs it on his bruises. And there was a show of hers at the Serpentine a couple of years ago. But she didn't necessarily consider herself an artist, but she made these extraordinary drawings, which she made with a pendulum. And she would use these drawings. Patients would come to her, and she would listen to them, and she would go into a meditation. She would make these drawings. You can see some of them on the wall. And so she definitely saw art as a therapeutic practice, as one that could access dimensions of the human body and the spirit that other things couldn't. Yeah, she's really great. And then I'm really interested in weaving, and there's a lot of weaving. And actually, weaving as a metaphor is something that sort of moves in and out of my book. And this is Lenore Tawney, who was, she had a guru. She moved, this is her in the 1950s. She was very close to Agnes Martin. And she was constantly exploring what she would see as very spiritual ways of using weaving to represent spiritual states. Then I just sort of, I sort of name check quite a lot of artists. Betty Sayre, the really brilliant African-American artist who has always been interested in dreams, spirits, voodoo, different ways of understanding the world through different kinds of energies. The great Ana Mendieta, the great Cuban artist here, Silhouette Works in Mexico, where she placed her body within nature and was very explicit about the kinds of energies that women's bodies can generate within nature and the metaphorical possibilities of the body in nature. I thought I'd put this in because this is Gośka Makuga, wonderful Polish artist based in London. This was her portrait of Madame Blavatsky. I actually saw this in a collector's home, and I went in and almost screamed because no one had warned me, and I'd never seen it before. It was quite funny. And this, for me, was an extremely important painting when I was writing my book. It's quite complicated to explain. These are a few of the ladies who made it. They're from the APY lands in central deserts of Australia. And art making for many of these communities is deeply entrenched in ideas of community, ancestral knowledge, understanding the land. In a sense, this painting is an extremely detailed map of the land that these people live on. And I saw this exhibition, this painting, in a really amazing exhibition that was curated in Canberra, which is my hometown in Australia, curated by the Indigenous curator at the Museum of Australia, Margot Neal, called The Seven Sisters. And it was this idea of the Seven Sisters they were chased by a wicked magician in the central deserts of Australia, and they ended up going into the sky and becoming the Pleiades. And really interestingly and very strangely, this is a myth that is also found in ancient Greek culture and also in Chinese culture. And the Seven Sisters seem to pop up everywhere. And it was really weird for me because I live in London near Seven Sisters Road. And I was like, what the hell? And so I looked into what that was about. And that was, the Seven Sisters was, again, very old. It was only centuries old, whereas this is tens of thousands of years old. It was a very old story about 7 sisters and an oak tree. So it was sort of this idea of the 7 sisters was weaving in and out of my imagination. Sorry, I didn't mean to go that way. And we can look at it once more. So yeah, this was made collectively over a period of time. And, you know, I look at this painting and it was staggeringly beautiful and profound and mysterious as well, because I don't have access to the knowledge that these women are exploring in this painting. But within one part of the painting, you can see the 7 sisters fleeing the wicked magician into the sky.
It's just fantastic. I mean, it's clear that all this art is completely spiritual. We don't have the access to everything, but we feel it. And this is fascinating.
Yeah.
At the size already, no, of this film.
I mean, there would be absolutely no separation in these communities in the APY lands between, you know, the separations we make. This is their life. This is their map. This is their understanding of the world. You know, it's concrete. So, yeah. I wrote, this is just a few little things, I wrote an essay for this artist, Sarah Smuts-Kennedy, in New Zealand, who makes her work using spiritual means and spiritual access. And she also explores this very minimal form of abstraction. This was an exhibition I saw recently. Oh, it was a variation of this in London. Grace Ndritu, who does rituals about birth of a new museum. So looking at museums, new ways for museums to be that aren't based on exploitation or theft or exclusion. They're really wonderful. Emma Talbot, a British artist who again explores different ways of being in the world through various forms of spirituality. During lockdown, I listened to a Zoom talk between Portia Zvavahera in her home in Zimbabwe and Helen Molesworth in New York. And I think her paintings are absolutely amazing. And she was talking about the importance of dreams and how every morning when she wakes up, she and her grandmother discuss their dreams, and many of her dreams make their way into her paintings. And this is how she makes sense of her sort of waking hours. And then I just wanted to finish with the drawing on the cover of my book, which is by my very dear friend, as I mentioned before, Donna Huddleston. And she's an amazing artist. And when we were trying to work out what to put on the cover, I went, how wonderful if Donna could be on the cover, because she was the one who introduced me to Hilma af Klint, and we discussed these things a lot. So it's a beautiful drawing.
Indeed. And it's perfect for my question, actually, my first question, because this dark bird, which is flying away, refers to a side we did not mention so much. It's also this dark and scary and terrifying side of this. I mean, it's called The Other Side. By the way, it's also a title of an Austrian book. In German, it's called Die andere Seite von Alfred Kubin. It's absolutely worth reading. He wrote the text and gave illustrations in 1908, I think. But it's a totally different thing. It was also made in a crisis. No, but my question is about this dark side. The other side is dark. It has beauty, but it's also terrifying. And this was often a reason why the people who were dealing with it were called to be crazy or to be hide away, you know. Or did that occur a lot to you?
Well, you know, my focus was on the therapeutic and the positive sides of the other side. And, you know, I think that a lot of the sort of myth-making around the negative aspects of exploring the spiritual realm have come from a suppression of ancient knowledge, of female knowledge, of different kinds of knowledge. I mean, even the word occult sounds creepy, but all it means is hidden knowledge. It's about looking for knowledge that has, for various reasons, been, you know, hidden from us. So I wasn't particularly interested in the negative side. And, you know, I'm not interested in people like Aleister Crowley, for instance, who I think is really sinister. You know, I was focusing on women, especially, who explored these things, and it didn't harm anyone else, and it enriched their lives.
The opposite, they try to heal, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe the real sickness is to avoid to think about the negative things in life, like to exclude death and all these things. And this might be the real sickness, and to heal it, you have to look at the things. No?
Yeah.
Well, we have...
It's hot.
Yeah, it's hot, and
probably all want to get outside.
We might open up to the public actually for not. You see, we could. I could listen for hours actually, and I want to thank you so much for all this research you put into that.
Oh, thank you.
I know it's personal interest over the years, but still, it's so well researched. So for somebody who has this book in hands, he gets a lot of knowledge with it, and beauty.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, but now I think we could open to the public who has questions because
Sophie. Yeah.
Sophie has one. Oh no, he has the microphone.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I just want to mention that last year, The Mirror and the Palette introduced your other book. So I think it's a great follow-up. But my question...
Every year one.
Yes. So we hope next year, the next one. So, and actually maybe I have a question for that book, or maybe it's already half written, we don't know. But in a way, you kind of introduced this kind of question also about, let's say, the modern figure of the artist and missing out female artists, but then again introducing a certain solitude to the question of how the other side is explored by women artists. And then I found it striking to see the Seven Sisters. And I wonder if in your research you came up with something about collaborative or collective forms of exploring the other side, and if there is a difference to it in a way of maybe also breaking a certain modern paradigm.
I mean, that's a great question, and actually collectivity is something that I'm thinking about now for maybe writing something else about. Oh, but, God, I shouldn't even say that, I'll hex it. But yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really interesting things was that a lot of this did emerge from, you know, collective ideas or collectives of women, you know, groups of women. In the 19th century, Georgiana Houghton is, you know, what's really wonderful with Georgiana, actually, you can read her autobiography on Kindle for like £1. And it's amazing. And she's always talking about her friends who are with her, who are helping her with her drawings, who are her spirits who are guiding her. So it's not just human or living human collectives, it's also spiritual collectives. In that Hilma af Klint had so many spirit guides who she was, you know, in communion with every day. And even after she stopped making work through them, she talked to them every day. You know, and I'm really interested in lots of contemporary ideas around collectivity and art making through a sort of therapeutic practice that also allows the individual to explore their own agency as well within those collectives. So, I mean, look at the last documentary, for example, you know. So I think that, yeah, this is something, these sort of intersections of therapy, both spiritual and physical, exploring new languages within art, and finding a sort of communality that isn't based on the exclusions of the past is something that's very current, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, anyone else?
Hi, thank you, first of all. I'm personally very, very touched by all the artwork and how you talk about it, so I'm very grateful right now. Thank you. And I'm just wondering how you decided which artists you put into the book and which you didn't. What was the selection process like?
I mean, yeah, that's such a good question, because actually the awful thing is once you end up doing a book, you realize that you've exerted your own exclusions, you know, so, you know, I Dr. Heal thyself. So, really, it was, and it was like the book before, it was a very organic thing. It was almost like having a conversation with myself and other people and seeing where that conversation would go. I mean, there were certain structures that I thought needed to be put in, like in terms of the beginnings of modern spiritualism and the Fox sisters and, you know, those sort of things I think you just needed to know because they had such an impact on art, and the life of Madame Blavatsky. But then, especially when we get more and more into the 20th and 21st centuries, there were so many artists I could have included, and, you know, it could have been 3 times the length. But So really, it felt like a very personal, and this book is a very personal book too, because my story weaves in and out of it, and so it's really selecting work that touched me at various points in my life for various reasons. So it's a sort of autobiographical look through art as well. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Oh, God. Sorry,
Hello.
there's suddenly so much of my voice. Hi. We're in Astrid's class and we're thinking a lot about the idea of like creative under limitation. And it seems that the connecting thread from listening to is like, if you're occluded from reality in some way, like you can't have access to power, then maybe it's easier for you to look at the occult because you're sort of, you're blocked off and you need to kind of imagine a new reality.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, how does like the academy and institutions interact sort of fairly with these artists who've been pushed out?
What do you mean by the academy?
Also, like when you get kind of ceremonially included into institutions, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, they were excluded for, a long time, basically, and, even with MoMA's exhibition Inventing Abstraction in 2011, Hilma af Klint wasn't included in it because the curator felt that she wasn't an artist, she was a clairvoyant, as if artists are neat little packages that don't have other influences in them. I think in terms of the first part of what you said, I totally agree that I think that a lot of women turn to the occult or to various forms of spiritualism because they were excluded from so much. And there is one theory around that they had been so conditioned not to use their own voices that they said, even if they believed it themselves, and I'm sure most of them did, they were saying, it's not me speaking, I don't have agency over this, I'm just a vessel, woman as vessel again. So it was a sort of get-out card for them, so they could explore these really complex, rich, strange worlds, but say, it's not me, it's just the spirit working through me. So it was a way of speaking and not speaking, sort of simultaneously. And in terms of the academy, I mean, as we all know, the role of the museum is something that's being constantly examined, and reshaped and redefined and challenged. And so, I mean, what was really amazing, I think it was 2 years ago, there was this massive show on spiritualism and ghosts and the supernatural that toured America. And the catalogue is, I've forgotten the name of the show, it's something like Supernatural. And it was one of the first really major museum shows to treat this idea seriously, with gravitas. Not that it was a bunch of lunatics sitting around a Ouija board, So, so the idea of the academy, I think, is something that is shifting in a good way, to accommodate the many exclusions of the past. Does that answer your question? Yeah, great, thanks. Thank you. Oh, there's a lady up the back. Sorry.
Did you bring some books to buy?
I really wish I had, but I didn't even have one of my own. So I borrowed Tina's. So sadly, no. Get me an Austrian publisher, now. Yeah. I'm sorry, but thank you for the question. Yeah.
When you said that art history writing is in progress, that sentence stuck in me, and I was imagining that then with all this rewriting and re-inclusion, it's becoming somehow bigger and just more enormous. And what do you think that, like, how can we consume and perceive this art history, which is just a lot more filled with information, so we are gonna see more little stories parallelly, or you think there will be also a bigger audience for art history, so people will just remember more names and artists, because obviously we cannot exclude those who are already written? Or in general, what do you think of the future of art history?
I mean, you know, the idea of expanding art history to accommodate these exclusions doesn't mean negating the brilliant achievements of the past. You know, I'm as in love with, you know, the great masters of painting, say, as, you know, the next person, and I'm never happier than in an art historical gallery. So it's not about pushing them aside. It's more about saying, these are brilliant artists, but other things were happening at the same time, and that art is a representation of humans, not just white men. And that's what the big shift has been. So... So yeah, it will mean that people will have, the slide tests will get a lot more complicated when they're doing art history. And, you know, but this is the beauty of it, in a way, that it's an ever-expanding field that, you know, to my mind, that's really exciting because there's so much more to look at and think about and understand. You know, this is an exciting thing. It's not narrowing down, or it's not a negating of anything else. It's about accommodating. Yeah. Oh, up here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fruitful conversation. I could have asked this during the class, but I saved it for the public. What was the most challenging part of researching, like reaching the primary sources of these female artists who came from like 19th century? Because, you know, when it comes to the female artists, it's really like their life is just like gone and vanished, and when you start to research them, then there is no institutional like support and etc. So what was the most challenging part of including their image like in your book?
Yeah, as you say, the most challenging thing was the silence. You know, that often there are images that we have access to, but we have no idea about, you know, the cultural context around it, or what people were saying, or what they were feeling. And that's why Georgiana Houghton in the 1860s writing an autobiography is just amazing. Like, you read this and you have a direct line into, you know, a seance in the 1860s. And she describes in great sort of almost boring detail. She goes on and on and on and on about what happens in seances. And so I read that and I was like, oh my God, this is absolutely fascinating. And, you know, there is still so much research being done. For example, Hilma F. Klint left behind, and I'm not exaggerating, 28,000 pages of notebooks. And so I met the man at that point. Only one man had read all 28,000 of them. It was his lockdown project. Yeah, he's a man in Sweden as part of the Hilma af Klint Foundation. And so I grilled him. You know, it was really fascinating. And there'd been a lot of debate, say, around Hilma af Klint, for example, like, you know, she never married, so was she straight? Or was she, I mean, I don't really care about all that stuff, but it was very clear that she was gay, you know, and she was a queer artist forging her own way. And she was very explicit about this in her notebooks. And so I had long conversations about that, and that was really fascinating. And Julia Voss wrote a really great new biography of Hilma af Klint, but already things are being updated with that. So again, we're learning more and more and more about these artists as research comes out. But also, what was really interesting was Hilma af Klint was often really bewildered by what she was receiving. She didn't understand it herself. And so her notebooks are full of her trying to understand her own creativity. But I do have a chapter in my book called The Benefits of Not Knowing. And because I've discovered, writing my book, that I was learning so much from not knowing, from not constantly being told, this is what it was like and this is carved in stone. You know, when you look at the woman of Holy Fens, you know, from 38,000 years ago, we have nothing to go on but to look at this object and try and form a response to it, which will never be correct and will never not be correct because we have no way of gauging it. And I think especially in the realm of art, where artwork can't be wrong, whatever wrong means in that context, I think that's really important to sort of hang on to too, that artworks aren't illustrations of neat formulas. Artworks are often really messy. They're as messy as humans. And so it was a way of sort of acknowledging that as well in my book. Yeah.
Thank you for introducing us to this fascinating work. I think can serve like an anthology of like artists who work into spirituality. Would you consider doing a sequel looking into other ethnic groups like in Africa and Asia, for example, just so as to have a broad vision of the whole thing, maybe?
I mean, that's an absolutely appropriate question, and it was something that I was very aware of, you know, but I felt that I didn't, at this point in my life, I didn't have the authority to speak to, I mean, I grew up in Australia, but in a very sort of Western education in Australia. And, you know, I'm still learning about First Nations Australian art, which is so full of riches and which is enormously complex. So at this point, because it was autobiographical, my book, in some ways, I wanted to focus on my culture and what I could know. And, you know, I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to go into, you know, like, belief systems in the Middle East or in African countries. I mean, it's so immense that I wouldn't even know where to begin. You know, I think I'd have to go back to study, you know, to even, yeah, because it's just so enormous. So, yeah. So this is definitely my sort of personal focus.
I was actually wondering about the title, since you mentioned so much about exclusion and also lying at the intersection between spirituality and female or female-identifying artists. The other side is kind of like also imposing this kind of otherness already in the title. So I was wondering, like, what your thoughts behind it were, because it's kind of a strong sense of imposing this in the title already, despite wanting something different.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to have an ambiguous title. You know, so the other side is obviously, you know, shorthand for the spirit world. She went over to the other side, but it's also the other side of art history, and that's what I wanted it to be about. You know, that there is another side to art history. The one that we were traditionally taught isn't necessarily the only one.
Are there any other questions that I don't see behind? I cannot walk in front of the speakers. No. Okay. So I would say thank you so much, Jennifer and Maria, for the talk.
Thank you so much, Maximilian. And thank you so much, Maria. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And as always, there's a lot more to mention because we have still ongoing festival program this week and a bit after. So on Thursday, there is an artist talk with Kaya, the last one here to happen in the pavilion. On Friday and Saturday, there will be the open studios again at the Fortress. On Friday evening, there is the last iteration of our Crisscross music program. And then there is still ongoing Shulia Chang's exhibition at Trackelhaus. And there will be another exhibition in September with the students of University of Applied Arts Vienna, also in Trackelhaus, opening in the framework of the festival. And then the anniversary of Summer Academy is finally coming to its end. So thank you so much for joining us, and see you soon again.